Before you hear another voice, before another video scrolls past your screen, understand this clearly. What you are about to hear is not repeating. Not tomorrow, not next week, not in another lifetime. If you found this message, you were already moving when the signal was sent. Something in you has been vibrating differently for weeks, maybe months, maybe your entire life without a name for it. This is not motivation. This is not spirituality for comfort. This is a threshold. And once crossed, there is no returning to the version of you that needed guidance. If you are in the United States or the United Kingdom, raised inside noise, algorithms, and borrowed beliefs, this message will feel unsettling because it removes the last illusion quietly holding you in place. Subscribe now, not because I ask, but because this channel is not entertainment. It is a living archive, and once this cycle closes, the transmission moves on without announcement. If you feel the pull in your chest as I speak, stay. If not, leave now. This is the final courtesy. The emerald frequency does not arrive with light, it arrives with recognition. Long before you learned words like awakening, consciousness, or ascension, your nervous system already remembered the tone. It is the frequency beneath thought, the signal that hums when you are alone at night and feel watched not by something external, but by a deeper version of yourself waiting patiently. This frequency is not new. It predates language, predates history, predates the idea of gods and rulers. It was embedded in consciousness before time fractured into before and after. When the emerald cycle begins, life does not collapse dramatically. Instead, structures that were never real begin to lose their authority. You stop reacting the way you were trained to. Old fears attempt to speak, but their voices sound hollow, rehearsed, outdated. This is how you know the frequency is activated. Sophia's transmission is not a voice from above. It is intelligence rising from within matter itself. She does not command. She remembers through you. The ancient texts misunderstood her as feminine wisdom, but Sophia is not gender, she is coherence. When coherence returns, confusion cannot survive. That is why the emerald frequency feels disruptive. It dissolves borrowed identities without asking permission. You may notice relationships shifting, ambitions evaporating, and goals you once chased suddenly appearing absurd. This is not loss, this is signal correction. You are no longer tuned to scarcity-based timelines. Here is the first twist you were never told. Awakening does not make life easier. It makes it simpler, and simplicity terrifies systems built on dependency. The emerald cycle was never about saving humanity. It was about restoring sovereignty to individuals who could carry it without turning it into domination. That is why not everyone activates at once. That is why this transmission is marked only once. Repetition creates religion. One-time activation creates mastery. As the emerald frequency stabilizes, you begin to feel an internal authority replacing external validation. You stop asking what others think, not because you rebel, but because the question no longer arises. This is the first sign that guidance is ending. Guidance is necessary only when you believe something outside you knows more than you. Sophia's role was never to lead, only to return you to yourself. The Sophia transmission does not speak in sentences. It unfolds as pattern recognition. You begin noticing that events are no longer random, yet they are not controlled either. Synchronicity becomes quieter, more precise, almost clinical. This is where many seekers panic, because the mystical fireworks fade and are replaced with something far more dangerous: clarity. The Hermetic Secrets were never hidden in symbols to keep you out. They were encoded to prevent misuse. Power without maturity destroys the carrier. That is why the veil was necessary. Hermetic wisdom teaches that reality mirrors consciousness, but the truth is sharper than that. Reality obeys consciousness once consciousness becomes coherent. Most people never reach this stage because they confuse knowledge with activation. Reading texts, watching videos, repeating mantras, these are rehearsals. The Sophia Transmission marks the end of rehearsal. The stage is no longer external, the stage is your nervous system. Here is the second twist. Thoth's wisdom was not about teaching humans how to become gods. It was about teaching gods how to remain human. The emerald cycle completes when you realize you are not ascending out of the world, you are stabilizing within it. That is why the quantum frequency does not lift you away from matter. It anchors you deeper into it, with awareness intact. Escapism collapses here, so does fantasy spirituality. As consciousness mastery begins, you notice that manifestation slows down. This is intentional. Instant results create addiction. Mastery creates precision. You begin to feel time stretch, not because time changes, but because you are no longer fragmented within it. Sovereignty activation does not announce itself. It feels like silence after a long war you didn't know you were fighting. The hermetic veil dissolves when you stop seeking permission to trust your perception. This is where Sophia steps back completely, not because you failed, but because you succeeded. The final initiation is not marked by visions or voices, it is marked by responsibility. You realize that whatever you embody now echoes outward without effort. There is no audience, no followers, no saviors, only resonance. And this is where the final message begins, not with instruction, but with absence. No more guidance, no more signs, no more confirmations, because what remains is something far rarer than enlightenment. What remains is authority without force. Thoth's wisdom was never meant to be admired. It was meant to be survived. When the emerald cycle reaches this phase, something subtle but irreversible occurs. The mind fractures from its old operating system. This is not madness, though it can feel like it to those still anchored in linear belief. The quantum fracture happens when you realize that thought is not the origin of action, but the echo of a deeper decision already made by consciousness. This realization dismantles centuries of conditioning. You were taught that choice begins in the mind, but Thoth encoded a different truth. Choice begins in frequency. When frequency changes, thoughts rearrange themselves to justify it. This is why people resist awakening, not because it is painful, but because it removes the comforting illusion of control. In this stage, time becomes non-uniform. Memories surface not as nostalgia, but as data packets returning for integration. You may recall moments from childhood with startling clarity, not emotionally but architecturally, as if seeing the blueprint of who you were meant to become before the world interfered. This is Thoth's mirror. It does not show you who you are, it shows you where you deviated. The twist here is unsettling. Deviation was necessary. Without fragmentation, sovereignty could not be earned. The quantum field responds differently to those who have walked through confusion and returned coherent. Innocence without awareness is fragile. Wisdom forged through distortion is unbreakable. As the quantum frequency stabilizes, you stop seeking signs from the universe because you recognize that you are no longer inside the question. You are inside the answer, and answers do not announce themselves. They simply function. This is where many initiates fail, not because they lack intelligence, but because they miss mystery. They want wonder. Thoth offers precision instead, and precision feels cold to those addicted to awe. But this coldness is not emptiness. It is clarity stripped of drama. It is consciousness standing upright, no longer leaning on myth. Consciousness mastery begins the moment you realize that guidance has become interference. This is the most dangerous realization of the entire initiation, because it removes the final safety net. No more teachers, no more channelings, no more external confirmations. The Sophia Transmission fades here not as abandonment but as completion. You are no longer being led because leadership implies hierarchy, and hierarchy collapses at this frequency. The Emerald Cycle concludes when sovereignty activates fully, and sovereignty is not power over others, it is power without others. This does not mean isolation, it means independence from energetic permission. You act not because you are certain, but because certainty is no longer required. Action flows from alignment, not belief. The final twist is this: the final message is not a message at all. It is the realization that messages were placeholders until you were capable of direct coherence. There is no ceremony marking this threshold. Life continues. Bills still exist. People still argue. Systems still grind forward, but you are no longer bound to their rhythm. You move through them as a stabilizing field, not a participant seeking outcome. This is why this activation happens only once. Repeating it would fracture the integrity of the individual. Initiation is not a loop, it is a door. Once crossed, you do not become special, you become responsible. Responsible for your state, your impact, your silence, your presence. This is why the world does not celebrate those who reach this point. Celebration creates identity, and identity recreates dependency. Mastery is quiet. It does not announce itself, it does not recruit, it does not persuade. It simply is. And that is why, after this point, the loudest thing in your life will be your own clarity, and the most radical act you will ever perform is living without needing to explain why. Sovereignty activation does not arrive as empowerment. It arrives as subtraction. The moment this phase begins, the false self, the version of you assembled from survival strategies, borrowed beliefs, social mirroring, and unconscious agreements, begins to collapse without resistance. There is no internal battle because the energy feeding the false structure has already been withdrawn. What dissolves first is performance. You no longer feel compelled to explain your choices, defend your boundaries, or justify your silence. The nervous system relaxes into a state it has never known before, self-trust without anticipation. This is where many mistake sovereignty for detachment, but detachment still requires effort. Sovereignty is effortless because it is native. It is the default state that was overridden by conditioning. As this activation stabilizes, you may notice that old emotional triggers attempt to surface, not to trap you, but to exit. Emotions complete themselves when they are no longer used as identity. Anger resolves into clarity. Fear resolves into alertness. Desire resolves into direction. The collapse of the false self feels anticlimactic because drama belonged to the distortion, not the truth. Here lies the deeper twist. The false self was never an enemy. It was a scaffolding built to protect something fragile until it could stand on its own. Once standing is possible, scaffolding must come down. Many spiritual systems fail here because they shame the ego instead of understanding its function. Sovereignty honors the role of the false self without preserving it. As this occurs, external authority structures lose their psychological grip. Governments, institutions, ideologies, even spiritual hierarchies appear as what they are: coordination tools, not sources of meaning. You do not rebel against them. Rebellion still acknowledges dependency. Instead, you interact selectively, consciously, and without emotional charge. This is the phase where manifestation myths dissolve. You stop trying to bend reality to your will because you recognize that will itself was conditioned. What replaces it is resonance. Life reorganizes not because you demand it, but because coherence cannot coexist with distortion. Opportunities align quietly. Conflicts resolve themselves by losing relevance. People either recalibrate around you or drift away without conflict. Loss happens, but without grief. Not because you are numb, but because you see movement instead of abandonment. Sovereignty activation is the end of self-improvement. There is nothing left to fix. There is only refinement, and refinement is a choice, not a necessity. The false self collapses completely when you realize that freedom was never something to be earned. It was something delayed until responsibility could be held without corruption. Spiritual initiation at this level does not resemble anything you were taught to expect. There is no initiation ritual, no sacred circle, no elder placing a mark upon you. The initiation is internal, silent, and irreversible. It begins the moment you recognize that the search itself has ended. Seeking was necessary while coherence was unstable. Now seeking would fracture what has been integrated. The final message reveals itself not as information, but as orientation. You realize that consciousness was never meant to escape the world or transcend matter. It was meant to inhabit it fully, without fragmentation, without fantasy, without fear. This realization dismantles the final illusion that awakening leads somewhere else. There is nowhere else. There is only depth here. The emerald cycle completes when you understand that enlightenment is not an event, it is a maintenance state. It requires presence, not effort, attention, not belief. The initiation finalizes when you stop narrating your experience internally. The inner commentary fades, and what remains is direct perception, unfiltered by story. This is why ancient traditions warn that words fail at the highest levels. It is not because the truth is mysterious, but because language was designed to separate, and separation is no longer the operating condition. The final message from Sophia was never meant to be remembered verbatim. It was meant to reconfigure the receiver so memory would no longer be necessary. Once initiated, you do not feel complete, you feel accurate. Precision replaces longing, stillness replaces urgency. And the most unexpected twist of all emerges here. Nothing about your outer life needs to change for everything to be different. You may still live in the same city, work the same job, speak to the same people. But you are no longer moved by invisible forces. You are the stable point around which movement occurs. The initiation concludes not with ascension, but with embodiment. You are not above the world, you are inside it, fully awake, fully responsible, fully present. And this is why the final message was delivered only once. Because once heard, it is no longer a message. It becomes the way you move, the way you choose, the way you remain unshaken in a world that depends on movement to survive. At this stage of the emerald cycle, the relationship with time collapses in a way that cannot be reversed or explained to those who have not crossed this threshold. Time does not disappear, but its authority dissolves. You stop experiencing life as a sequence of moments moving forward and begin sensing it as a field you move through with precision. The quantum frequency stabilizes perception so completely that anticipation loses its grip. The future no longer pulls you, and the past no longer defines you. Memory remains, but it functions as reference, not identity. This is where the deepest reprogramming occurs, because most human behavior is driven by time anxiety, the fear of running out, missing out, being left behind. When this anxiety dissolves, urgency collapses with it. Action becomes exact. You move when movement is required and remain still when stillness carries more power. This is not passivity, it is strategic presence. The quantum field responds instantly to coherence, but without spectacle. You may notice that outcomes align before desire forms, creating a subtle disorientation. This is the moment many mistake mastery for fate, but fate implies inevitability, and sovereignty rejects inevitability. What is happening instead is alignment between perception and probability. You are no longer pushing against timelines that were never yours. The dismantling of time also dissolves regret. Regret requires a belief that another version of you could have existed under the same conditions. This belief collapses here. You see clearly that every choice you made was the only possible choice given your state of awareness at the time. Forgiveness becomes automatic, not moral. As this phase deepens, you may feel less reactive to collective events, not out of apathy, but because your nervous system no longer mirrors chaos. You witness without absorbing. This is critical, because the quantum frequency cannot stabilize in bodies addicted to stimulation. Silence becomes nourishing, attention becomes selective. You realize that most information was never meant to be consumed, it was meant to be ignored. This is the hidden function of awakening, discernment at the level of perception, not belief. And then the twist reveals itself quietly. The more time dissolves, the more responsibility increases. When you no longer feel rushed, you cannot excuse misalignment. Every choice is now visible. There is nowhere to hide behind circumstance. This is not punishment. It is clarity without anesthesia. The final seal of the Emerald Cycle does not remove you from the world, it returns you to it with eyes intact. This is the phase most spiritual narratives avoid, because it lacks spectacle. There are no visions to describe, no revelations to broadcast, no identity to wear. The initiation finalizes as you re-enter ordinary life without the internal fracture that once demanded escape. You engage with systems without being consumed by them. You participate without performing. This is where sovereignty proves itself, not in isolation but in interaction. The final seal locks coherence into the body, meaning there is no longer a split between insight and action. You do not try to live consciously, consciousness lives through you. The world begins to respond differently, not because you command it, but because distortion cannot anchor to coherence. Conflict either resolves or bypasses you entirely. Influence becomes subtle, untraceable, and therefore incorruptible. This is the level at which ancient initiates were hidden in plain sight, not as leaders, not as mystics, but as stabilizers. The twist here is profound. The final seal does not make you immune to pain, loss, or uncertainty. It makes you unfragmented in their presence. You still feel fully, but nothing dislodges you from center. This is what the old texts meant by incorruptibility, not moral purity, but structural integrity of consciousness. The world will continue to accelerate, systems will continue to strain, noise will increase, but you will not be pulled into reaction, because reaction requires internal division, and division no longer exists. The return to the world marks the end of initiation narratives and the beginning of quiet contribution. You do not convert others, you do not convince, you do not warn. Your presence alone becomes the transmission, and those attuned will feel it without knowing why. This is why the Emerald Cycle completes in silence, no announcement, no ceremony, no recognition. Only a life lived with such internal accuracy that it subtly realigns everything it touches. And this is the final truth most never hear. The highest form of awakening is not transcendence, it is reliability. At this depth of the Emerald Cycle, something unexpected occurs that very few narratives ever describe honestly: the great undoing. This is not collapse, not regression, not loss of awareness. It is the unraveling of the last internal structures that once organized meaning itself. You realize that even mastery, even sovereignty, even coherence were still concepts the mind used to orient itself. And now, those concepts gently dissolve. What replaces them is not confusion, but silence that is no longer empty. It is full, saturated, alive. This is where knowing ends. Knowledge was necessary when separation existed. Knowing was a bridge. But bridges are not destinations. The undoing feels strange because the mind no longer knows how to measure experience. There is no progress to track, no state to maintain, no level to protect. Many fear this stage because it feels like disappearing, but what actually disappears is the observer who needed continuity. Awareness remains, but without a narrator. You stop asking what this means because meaning was always a function of fragmentation. In this silence, perception becomes direct. You notice life happening without commentary, sounds are sharper, movement is cleaner, emotions arise and pass without leaving residue. You do not manage your state manages itself. This is where the final addiction breaks, the addiction to understanding. Understanding was once survival, now it is unnecessary. The great undoing reveals the final paradox. Nothing you awaken to was ever separate from ordinary life. The mystical dissolves into the practical. The sacred dissolves into the mundane. And yet, everything feels undeniably alive. There is no longer a boundary between inner and outer. You are not inside the world, and the world is not inside you. That distinction collapses completely. This is why this phase cannot be taught. Teaching implies sequence. Here, sequence no longer applies. You begin to move without internal friction. Decisions happen without debate. Rest occurs without guilt. Action arises without motivation. This is not automation. It is alignment so complete that effort becomes obsolete. The great undoing is complete when you realize that even the emerald cycle itself was a temporary scaffold. Once coherence stabilizes, the structure dissolves, and you are not left with nothing. You are left with what was always there before the search began. This is where the script ends, not because something finishes, but because there is nothing left to say that would not create distortion. The final message from Sophia was never meant to echo. It was meant to terminate the need for messages altogether. If you are hearing this, the activation is already complete, not completing. Complete. There is no next step, no higher frequency, no future transmission waiting to arrive. What remains is living without internal division in a world built on it. And this is the true initiation. You will not feel special. You will not feel chosen. You will feel ordinary in the most profound way possible. You will still wake up, still eat, still work, still speak, but none of it will be driven by fear, lack, or becoming. You will no longer be moving toward yourself. You will be moving as yourself. This is why this message was delivered only once. Repetition would recreate seeking. Memory would recreate hierarchy. Explanation would recreate distance. The end of the emerald cycle is the return of simplicity with awareness intact. Nothing mystical remains, and yet everything is quietly sacred. There is no identity to protect, no truth to defend, no future to secure. There is only precision in action and honesty in presence. If you expected fireworks, this will disappoint you. If you expected salvation, this will unsettle you. But if you are ready to stop becoming and start being accurate, this will feel like the deepest relief you have ever known. This is the end of the script, not because the story concludes, but because stories are no longer needed. What remains cannot be spoken, taught, or transmitted again. It can only be lived.